Well, hello, everyone that's coming in now. We see that we have just under 30 participants, so we're giving everyone a chance to get into the Zoom room, and we want to welcome you for our third in our series of 4 conversations post 2020 presidential election. So I would love to do a few housekeeping items and then turn it over to our moderator for today, Quade French from the Office of Campus Wellbeing and Education. So before Quade takes over, I just want to remind everyone that you are to put your questions in the Q&A box. If you have questions, feel free to use the chat for any comments that you'd like to share. And this is really a safe, brave space for reflection and inquiry. So please be respectful at all times of not only the participants, but of the moderator and panelist as well. So we're going to spend the next 70 minutes together, and this is the third of 4 series or 4 conversations that we have in the series. We want to remind you that next week we will have Dr. Pedro Noguera, our Dean of the Rossier School of Education, in conversation with Bob Schrum from our Center for Political Future. And I believe that it would be great at this time to say thank you to all of our partners. This is a Dornsife partnership with Rossier, the CET, and with our Center for Political Futures, and as well as our Campus Wellbeing and Education office. So we want to thank our partners, and with that, Quade, please get started.
Great, thank you for that, and thanks for all the attendees for taking time to join us today. My name is Quade French. I'm a clinical psychologist in the Provost Office of Campus Wellbeing and Education, and it's an honor to be here with our panelists. So I'll go ahead and introduce them, and then we'll get right to it. We have first Darlene Robles. Dr. Darlene Robles is currently an Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion and a Professor of Clinical Education at the Rossier School of Education here. She teaches in the Ed D Leadership Program and is a faculty advisor for the Preliminary Administrator Credential under Professional Development. Dr. Robles also serves as Rossier's Diversity Liaison to the USC Diversity and Inclusion efforts that are ongoing. Previously, Dr. Robles served for 8 years as the first Latina County Superintendent of the Los Angeles County Office of Education, the nation's largest regional service agency, and is an expert in the areas of urban education, program development, and school leadership. We also have Dr. Kimberly Freeman, is the Associate Dean and Chief Diversity Officer for Dornsife College. There, Dr. Freeman works with faculty, staff, and students to complete the development and implementation of a college-wide diversity strategic plan, which includes recruitment and retention of an increasingly diverse community, assessment of ongoing and proposed diversity initiatives, and cultivation of an inclusive college environment that promotes success for students, faculty, and staff. She supports mentorship and training initiatives, including training on topics related to DE&I, campus climate, civility, and equity. She also works to enhance the educational experience of students and establish an inclusive, welcoming environment for culturally diverse students, staff, and faculty. We also are joined by Kevin Brahim Kadi. Kevin Brahim is a senior learning and development partner with talent and organizational development in the USC Provost HR office. His areas focus on talent capability development in leadership, communications, emotional intelligence, inclusion and belonging, and employee relations. Outside of USC, Kevin Brahim serves as a learning media consultant for organizations seeking to build engaging video-based learning experiences to support a variety of onboarding, skill building, and professional development programs. With a background in entertainment as a professional actor, director, and writer, he seeks to embed authentic storytelling within learning pathways wherever possible. And we are joined by Kami Akavan, the executive director of the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future. Previously, he was CEO of procon.org, the nation's leading source of nonpartisan research on controversial issues. Kami avidly writes and speaks on numerous topics, including dialogue over division, how to save democracy through critical thinking, and why and how to teach controversial issues in the classroom. In In his role, Kami has over 20 years of experience in bridging divides at national levels, and as the executive director of the Center for Political Future, oversees operations of all center components, including the UNRWA Institute of Politics, the Fellows Program, the USC Dornsife LA Times poll, and community and global engagement. So thank you all for joining me here today in our discussion on bridging the divide. And I was hoping perhaps, Kami, you could start us off with providing us with some context and an understanding of how we got here even. You know, politics has been a part and difference has been a part of culture here in the United States for so long, but why does the divide feel so intense now that we need to devote time to talking about how to bridge it?
Thanks for the question, Quaid, and thanks for folks for joining us today. I see a lot of names I'm familiar with. I see you, Diane. Hi, Sarah. Hi, Therese. Thanks for making time to be part of this bridging divide process and kind of healing and licking our wounds to some degree. We had a record election, record turnout. We had, I'm looking at my screen now, about 149 million votes were cast in this election so far, and we're still counting. And that's the highest number that it's been in about 100 years, or if not longer. So those votes fell largely into two parties, and those two parties are increasingly farther apart than they have ever been. And most of us have identified with one or the other of those parties. And so that means that all of us end up in one or the other camps. And it's become something where it not only feels like we can't relate to people who are from the opposite political party. And that divide is something that we're feeling, not just in politics and how we cast our votes, but we're seeing it in our communities. We're seeing it at the governor's levels. We're seeing it at municipal levels and city governments increasingly becoming polarized. We're seeing it at our dinner tables with our family members. And as we're looking forward to Thanksgiving, some of us might be wondering, yikes, how are we going to navigate those conversations? So to your point, Quaid, though, why does it feel this divided? Because we are literally at the highest level of polarization that we have ever experienced in this country. I was looking at charts and graphs from the period of the Civil War. We're looking at 1879 polarization and comparing it today. And today it's higher. It's higher as party polarization and individual polarization. So that's not a good sign. And the way that it manifests itself is in our personal relationships. So people now increasingly care more if their son or daughter marries someone of the opposite political party. 1960, when they asked parents if they would care, 2-3% of parents said they would. Flash forward to today, it's close to 40% of parents who said they'd be upset if their child married someone of the opposite party. And our polls are getting farther apart. So what is considered, when they ask Democrats and Republicans, do you think the other party is a threat? About 1 out of 4 Democrats said that Republicans are a threat to the nation's well-being, and 1 out of 3 Republicans said that Democrats are a threat to the nation's well-being. And just let me put an exclamation point on it, and then I'll stop. A similar poll that was done in 2019, beginning of last year, they asked folks, do you think we'd be better off as a country if large numbers of the opposing party just died? And 15% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats said yes. So that's where we're at, Quaid. That's the context for why it feels so awfully divided, because we are historically highly divided.
Thanks for that reflection, Kami. I'd like to open it up to the rest of the panelists to reflect on what we've heard as well, and your experiences of this polarization in your work.
I can start. Well, I've been with USC for 3 years now, but I've been a member of the Los Angeles community my entire life. And seeing, how fractured things are now from the perspective of both resident and also someone who is working in higher education, I'm dismayed, but I'm also hopeful because I've lived through the civil unrest of 1992, which was another time that I felt we were very polarized here in the city. So I'm just focusing locally on life as an Angelino or living in the LA region. And I saw some tremendous work being done by some very dedicated community servants to bring together, all parts of the city. And USC, given its location, was a key player, I believe, in that effort. And so I see USC having a critical role going forward, especially being a higher education institution, to helping bridge gaps and create the space for dialogue across differences.
I appreciate your historical context coming from the Civil War to present. And having lived through many of the things that Kimberly, from the Watts riots to the Rodney King to the civil rights turmoil in the 60s and walkouts of students in the 70s. What the noticeable difference for me, and I do have hope that it can change, is the incivility that I sense more than I did then. Yes, there are protesters and anger and but for the most part, even though of us that were actually in the streets and protesting, we still had a way to communicate with others in a different setting, or at least I remember that. And I think that's something that I would like us to continue to reflect on, how we can be more engaging and listening and being civil. Not that I'm going to persuade or convince you to my point of view, but that we do it in a way that provides an opportunity for us to remain in a relationship and not rupture it. And then I think that's something that I think we can, as Kimberly said, we can be a model for that because we're very diverse in lots of our identities here at USC. So if we can model, that would be helpful, because I think that's the part that I'm struggling with, and trying to find ways to incorporate ways that we can be more respectful and civil with each other.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, this civility, right? And in our prep for this meeting, a concept that came up that really seemed to resonate was this idea of in-grouping and out-grouping, and people really retreating into their camps. I mean, Kami, the statistics you provide around believing that things would be better if a certain percentage just up and died, I think can be shocking for people. So what are your thoughts about sort of this retreating into the in-group, out-group? And then also, in what ways does that prevent us from moving forward, from thinking it's okay to take that step if we're so sort of entrenched in our own positions?
Yeah, I'd like to build on, as we go into this reflection there, I'd like to build on everything that's been shared thus far. And again, thank you, Kami, for sharing that. And I'm really curious about the polarity of the stories we're telling in our in-groups and out-groups. At a global level and at a local level. So for me, just a little personal reflection on my background. My father's an immigrant, is in the US Armed Forces for 30 some odd years. I moved around my whole life living overseas as an American, in other cultures, and what that meant for me and how I framed my understanding of what it meant to be American in that setting. And so really didn't come to understand left and right until I was in college and beyond. And so I'm curious, specifically thinking about USC and also in just in our local communities, how we can start to break down those kind of global polarity stories that are being told and reinforced, and bring them closer to local perspectives. And I think once we do that, we'll have more bandwidth and runway to actually start deconstructing them and get closer together into commonalities and shared interests and shared understandings. So I'd be curious to reflect on that as well as we continue, like what the distinction would be between like this big left and right global kind of pole, and then what it looks like on a local, more localized level, which is what I think we're all experiencing right now in our families, in our social circles, in the workplace. So I'd be interested in that as well.
Quaid, if I may, that's a great place for me to insert a comment. I was sharing with the panel earlier, I listened to a dialogue that was conducted by the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. And John Powell, who runs that center, said it's harder to hate up close. And so that's why I think it's important to really get hyper-focused on what we can do within our campus community and within our departments and organizations at USC, because it really starts with a conversation. I know that there's a lot of angst and people feeling like I'm tired of talking. Talking is not working, but it really starts with the building blocks of good, solid relationships. And those relationships can be formed in a place like USC because it's a place where students are in a transformative time of their lives, whether they're undergraduates or graduate students. And we as administrators and faculty and members of the USC community benefit from that energy they bring, and that curiosity that they bring. They're here for a reason. They want to learn, they want to grow, they want to be mentored. And so I think it's a learning opportunity for everyone. So we have to turn USC into a learning organization and an incubator of sorts for these very localized conversations that Kevin Brahim is referring to.
Is Kami here. Kimberly, I completely agree with what you just said. I've been in this bridging divide space for a long time, and all of us who attend conferences, we hear a lot of acronyms, right? Where someone gets really cute with solutions to a problem. One acronym has stuck with me for these 20 years, and I completely buy into it. This is what can work for bridging divides. And all of the points you just made fit into this. So number one is exposure. Exposure to opposing ideas. We're so often in our little echo chambers, we cannot fathom how someone could possibly think the crazy thoughts they think. And the reality is that they think the same of us, right? And so exposure is one. The other is engagement. And we've all talked about this to some degree. We have to interact with people with whom we disagree, because we'll find out that we probably have far more in common with them than our politics would have us believe. The third, and to the point about USC, is education. Not just education about issues and candidates, but education about why we are compelled to disagree with each other. Why is it that we are not getting along? And fourth is elevation. And that is modeling what civil discourse looks like and elevating those situations where, let's say, a couple who is a Republican and a Democrat who you would think would hate each other, but they're married, right? Or these kinds of opposites in love kind of stories. Those are the kinds of things that we can and do elevate at this university. And for me, those 4 E's, as annoying as I personally find these acronyms, I really think it comes down to those 4 things: exposure, engagement, education, and elevation.
I think those are great points. I am thinking about conversations that I've had with staff and just really anybody in America today. And I think there are 2 things that I think sort of people are thinking about. One is why, right? And I think, Kami, your 4 E's are getting at the how, which hopefully we can expand on later. But I think for many, there's that question of why. Why would I want to engage and exert that effort on my part to connect with someone who has very different beliefs than I do? And I think that can play out differently, perhaps the why may be different in a workplace setting than sort of at the dinner table. So I don't know if the group can expand on this a bit, because that's really, I think, foundational to our time here, is helping understand why people should be trying to bridge this divide in the first place.
I can speak to that quickly. I think one of the things I like to think about is, what's the outcome you're seeking, or what's in it for you in that, and what's the investment that you're putting in, and what are you seeking to come out of that conversation? So really reflecting on how you show up in those conversations and when you show up, right? So do you need to show up to a conversation like that? It's something I've been thinking about a lot. We feel obligated a lot of times, certainly in social settings and in our families, but then even in the workplace. What does that look like? So really for ourselves, doing the self-reflection to understand when you will show up to a conversation about politics, or make that effort to bridge that divide, and set those ground rules for yourself prior to being in a situation where you have to have the discussion. I think there's a lot of anxiety and anticipation of it happening, but if we can compartmentalize a little bit and think about, like, what would it look like with my family? What would it look like in my social circle? What would it look like in public if I'm at the grocery store and something happens to somebody next to me and I want to be an ally? Or what would it look like at work to hold space for differing opinions on politics? So thinking about your various roles, those intersectional identities that come to this conversation, and then, what is the outcome you're seeking? So if you're focused on that, and there's a bridge that you're building for your personal life or your work life or whatever it may be, that'll help you in advance of getting to that situation where the conversation starts. And maybe you haven't had the time to reflect on, do I even want to do this right now? And then the other thing I would share is just that you don't always have to have the conversation. It's not incumbent on all of us to constantly be in this stage, because for many people, it's not safe. And if you're in a conversation that isn't safe, or where ground rules haven't been agreed upon, then that's where you really want to be able to know how you will process that and handle that experience, because it's different for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Kevin, because I want to add to that part of education is always asking ourselves, are we curious? Are we curious enough to learn more? And I think you're right. We have to find the space to do that, particularly on a topic that's very emotional and we get emotional about it and we get triggered. But if we can pause and reflect and say, okay, I'm going to take a step back and see how I can be curious about wanting to find out why. Not that I'm going to get into a defensive argument, but just listen. And sometimes we're so busy in our work and our day-to-day life, we don't really listen to each other. We miss cues. We take someone's comment and we go to what I call the dark side, versus saying, well, wait a minute, help me understand that. I don't think I heard that right. Or maybe it was, can you tell me more? And we need to take time. Relationships take time. And particularly in your work setting where you're going to work with individuals throughout your career or in different places, we have to take time to build those relationships. And particularly if you're a person that's sitting in power, if you're in a role you have positionality of power and you want to have people engage, you have to be cautious about that, because people are going to want to serve the boss, right? Or serve the one that has the power. And so how do you step back and allow for a conversation to happen if that's the place to have it? As you said, Kevin and Brave, it's not necessarily the time, but I think we need to focus on education as being curious, being open, and willing to listen to other perspectives as a way of learning. People have heard me say, my learning curve is here all the time at SC. I'm like this. I don't rock climb, but this is me because I want to learn. And I think the day that we all, particularly in education, want to stop learning, then we're going to be stagnant. And we need to be open to that.
And
go ahead, Kimberly.
I'm sorry, Kevin. I would just add to that, because Darlene said two things that really resonated. She said many things, but these two things really I bring out some points I want to make. Listening and leadership. I think that leaders have to have the courage that others may not have. I mean, you kind of have to go into places where others may not feel confident or comfortable going into as a leader. And I was reading, I have like many different, materials that I read around community building and diversity, equity, and inclusion plans, how you bring people together from all kinds of backgrounds and walks of life. And in this one particular book that I was reading for today, it said, the ability to listen is an act of leadership. So modeling that behavior and being able to hold space for different points of view amongst your team members or, your colleagues in other parts of the campus is a huge leadership skill. And there's another thing that this particular resource manual said, is that when we come at people with our own painful emotions, it's often hard for them to hear the legitimacy of our concerns. So if you're not willing to stay in that open, place of inquiry and curiosity, then you may not understand the pain that people are experiencing on the other side, and they certainly won't understand your pain. And so I think that it is a leadership skill to engage in these more challenging conversations and to go into a place where, it may feel uncomfortable, it may feel unnatural, because we have to do something. We cannot continue to kick the can down the road and pretend like this is normal to function in a way where we're not having conversations with people who don't think like us.
Quid, can I pile on too? Because I think this question that you asked is perhaps the most fundamental. Why should I bother, right? The purpose of the conversation. If there's no purpose, then what's the point, right? So we have to have that purpose guiding it. So we talked about the risks of not and the rewards for doing it. And that's kind of how I see it. So on the one hand, one of the benefits, we live in a unique form of democracy that exists here and nowhere else. And a requirement, a civic duty for this system to function is that we have to disagree with one another, compromise on policy, and move forward as a nation. And if we disengage from politics and issues because it's scary and we don't like to have those things because they're uncomfortable, then that means that our system of governance does not get the oxygen it needs to function. So we have to do it. I think Van Jones described it as a type of resiliency. He says you can't pave the jungle. Once we are in our society, we need to have that personal resiliency. We need to know what it feels like to have someone challenge us, say you're wrong, and to have the confidence and the wherewithal to be able to say, I don't think so, and here's my reasons why not. That is a life skill. That feels good to do it. And I'll give you another reason. It is natural. We are social creatures. Human beings need each other. And when you look at places like, let me give you this example. Yesterday was Veterans Day. I talked to a veteran yesterday, and a week ago, I talked to someone who, both of these folks were involved in conflict resolution in war zones. One of them was in Iraq and 3 deployments as a peace negotiator, and the other was placed in South Africa and Northern Ireland. So people who were shooting at each other, killing each other's families, their roles were to say, guess what, let's get past that. And no, people don't want to get past that, right? They feel physically threatened, they're being shot at. So how do they do it? How do they build resiliency? You know what both of those folks said was the reason that motivated people? What was their why? They said it was the desire to have a common humanity. The common humanity was both of them said this word, and they had never met each other. They said that was what brought those people together. We are social animals. We need that common humanity, and we need to be able to identify with one another. So to the why, you have to do it. You want to do it. It feels good to do it. And if you don't do it, we're in big trouble. That's why.
I agree. There was a great reference. I love that, sort of the humanity as why, right? And wanting to put that effort in, knowing that it's for the betterment of society, really, in the end. I know that in a lot of the work that we do in our office, we work with people who are really struggling. And in so many ways, for so many, the context in which we are living our lives is really challenging. We're talking about the pandemic. We're talking about the ongoing fight for racial equity. Many have been experiencing that their entire lives already, and then you just pile on all these other stressors. And so I know that in meeting with people, many feel that they don't have the reserves to engage. They don't have the reserves to be patient, to be curious. And I just think that that's a huge reality that we're facing now. And that's in some ways separate from this desire to be there, to stand up, to help advocate. But then I'm reminded, sort of also, Darlene and Kimberly, what you were mentioning around power and responsibility. And I think that that's a really interesting position that people can find themselves in. For some who have power, maybe they're in positions of management or leadership, it's not necessarily a choice, right? Whether you stand there and stand up for those people in your organizations or not. For others, if they're sitting at the dinner table, maybe they feel that they have a bit more choice. But let's say, right, that they're sitting in, they're listening to this conversation, they're recognizing that, yes, I too want to stand up for a better humanity. I recognize that there are people who disagree with me. I recognize that for all sorts of reasons of safety, security, stress, I'm retreating further into my own camp, and I'm seeing the other as the enemy. Let's say that they put all that sort of aside and say, I want to engage. I want to be a part of these conversations. Let's shift perhaps to the how, like those E's that you were getting at, Kami. And there was a question, or a question that was brought up. I think Kevin Brahimi brought this up the other day. Let's say you've made the choice. So then how will I show up for people if I don't feel the same way? Right. So maybe we can start to unpack this piece a bit, the hows. So I know, Kami, you started off, but sort of opening it up to the group, sort of what perhaps are those initial things a person might need to do to check in with self, to assess readiness, and then strategies to engage?
Yeah, I think, we've touched on several different strategies already, and there are many more out there. I think, when we look at crucial conversations as a training methodology, which is out there and people can look that up, one of the things that you do prior to even coming into a conversation that's heightened with high stakes and high emotions is to start with yourself, right? That self-reflection and mastering your own story, right? So understanding the stories you're telling yourself before you even arrive to discuss something that's alternate from what you believe. So we have to unpack that, right? And make sure we understand like what's real about the conversation that's happening and what's the story I'm telling myself based on everything outside of it. And then making sure that there's that safe space in the dialogue, right? So you have to agree on boundaries. What are the left and right boundaries of this conversation? What are we focusing on together in this? And that's a real challenge in this environment, right? Because you're not always going to have willing participants on both sides, but let's assume that you can say, hey, we're going to focus on this one point, right? And we're going to stay curious and we're going to keep asking why, right? As opposed to seeking to persuade. Because that's the gut instinct that we all have, which is, I believe in my position and I'm here to help get you there, as opposed to I'm here to understand why you're so far apart or why we are so far apart in this discussion, right? So keeping that curiosity at the core, but making sure that that area, that pool of shared meaning that you're discussing within stays kind of sacred and so that you can stay within it. So those are a couple of the fundamentals, just making sure that you start with yourself, understand the stories you're telling yourself, unpack them, make space for the other narrative or point of view or perspective, and then keep in that curious place. You'll have to keep coming back to it because throughout the conversation, you're going to get pulled in other directions that distract from the core curiosity of, tell me more. What is it that is contributing to that belief, So those are just a couple of the fundamentals surrounding that.
I really, go ahead, Kimberly.
Yeah, I was going to say probably what you were about to say, Quay. I really like that, Kevin Brahim. I think that you touched on a lot of the things that I would recommend. I would also like to bring into the conversation the tools of intergroup dialogue, because I think what we need to remember is that we're not engaging in debate or discussion per se, but more so dialogue. And the goal of dialogue is to connect. So asking those very fundamental, open-ended questions that are much more about seeking to understand is really, I think, a key tool of intergroup dialogue. If we are debating someone, we want to win and we want to be right. But this isn't a time for us to be right. This is a time for us to really listen. And I said on our prep call to lean in, to borrow from Sheryl Sandberg, but this really is about taking a seat at the table and leaning into the conversations that are going to challenge us in ways that we haven't been challenged before. So I think that we need to move from debate or discussion to dialogue and understand that with dialogue comes a responsibility to keep it open, to really be respectful of the other person's opinion or point of view, and then make sure that the ultimate goal is to connect and to have shared meaning.
Great. So you both have, oh, go ahead, Darlene.
Well, I'm just going to add that what I love about the dialogue is that you go in with the intent of broadening your perspective. You don't go in with, I'm going to tell you my point of view and you're going to agree. So as long as we continue to be where I'm going to broaden and learn and do it in a way that's respectful to each other, then I think you can move to then that common, there's something bigger than us. There's humanity. And I think we have to always keep that in mind. We may not be there at the beginning because we're very much into our own self-interest, which is human. But then when do we broaden that perspective and when can we engage? And going back to what you just said, very at the beginning, Kevin and Brian, is that we have to really be reflective of where we are at that point and that it's okay if I'm not ready. There's no judgment. And that we're going to be, when we're ready, then how do we engage in a way that's safe and to broaden our perspective?
Yeah, I love that. That makes me sort of really think about those internal processes that need to happen before we lean in, right? So before we lean in, where do we find the courage to even do that? And Kami, you were talking about what our goals might be. And maybe it's a goal to work toward a common humanity that can be civil and treat each other better. And maybe that's something we really believe in. And Darlene, as you're bringing up too, if we can approach, and the others as well, if we can approach this with curiosity as our goal, right? Instead of confrontation. And I love, Kimberly, what you were saying. It's not about being right as much right now, but it's about being willing to listen. But being able to lean in that way could be really helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate that point, Quaid. And what I want to comment about that is there's a fear for having these kinds of conversations, right? The outcome can feel terrible, right? The consequences can be dramatic. Now, my sister won't talk to me and hasn't talked to me for a long time. My neighbor thinks I'm a jerk, right? I mean, not me, but these are the kinds of examples that people are afraid of the outcomes. But what I want to emphasize is that it's not our fault, right? We did not create this situation. And there's a certain comfort in knowing that we did not shrink the public square where there's fewer opportunities to interact with people with whom we disagree. We didn't make union and church participation lower. We didn't make malls start to die off and movies and concerts and the public square shrink. We didn't put money into the political system. We didn't erode the bipartisan precedents in Congress. We didn't change the primary system to increasingly favor extremist candidates. We didn't invent social media so that it could further amplify our echo chambers. We didn't tell Google how to devise its algorithms so that it can feed us more of what we want. We didn't do so many of these things. We didn't change the educational system to focus so much on STEM and less so on the critical thinking skills that we get from social studies and the humanities. And yet this is our world. And what's sad is that now we, the people, have this burden. We have to fix the problem because now it's on us. We didn't create the problem, but we are burdened with the solution, right? And so being a informed digital citizen in the year 2020 is a much more complicated proposition than citizens have had decades ago. You turn on the news, there's 3 major news stations. They're all pretty good. You know what's going on in the world. Now you turn on your social media or your television, there's 3,000 things to choose from. You can't tell what's right from what's not. Some bits are incomplete. So we just kind of curl up with whatever feels good, and that's a danger, right? And so we put ourselves, so it's incumbent on us to push ourselves out of these echo chambers. And to that point, and the last thing I'll say about this is, you talked about finding and pursuing this common humanity. For me, it's less of a discovery than it is a reminder that humanity is there. And I'm reminded of it in so many examples, and I'll share one later, but I don't think it's about discovery because we feel it whenever we make those connections with people. It is inherent in our species. It is inherent in our capacity as humans. And it's just a matter of reminding ourselves what we have in common versus what divides us.
You're right. I sort of love what you were saying there, and getting again to those barriers of bridging those divides, because I don't think it can be stated enough that that's what's challenging. We're talking about strategies. For the most part, I think people know how to have conversations with people about various topics. People have been disagreeing on things for a long time, but as we've been talking about, things just are really heightened now, right? And the barriers to reaching out and being the one to engage first may be really challenging, or to respond first. And so that you're bringing up the really intense fear that can exist for people in doing that, I think is important. And what also, if it's anger, so if it's not so much fear about what could the potential outcome of a conversation could be, but just such abject anger, right, that the other person is inherently morally evil or something, right? Or that they're supporting positions or policies that have fundamentally or personally hurt me or the ones I care about. What do you say to those people around this issue of anger that they feel in this as well, and how to think about working through that? Or I guess I should say, do they need to? Are they allowed to be justified in their anger as well?
Well, as a trained actor who spent a lot of time working to tap into my emotions and make sure they were always authentic and present, I would say anger is good and you need to feel it. How you act upon that anger is a different story. So I think it's okay to be angry. I think that's part of it. It's how do we process that and how do we let that bring us back into conversation again, and how does it become motivation and fuel rather than a detriment that draws us further down. But overall, just thinking about that question and that dilemma about, you know, how can you bring more of your opportunity to live in the space of like a non-binary world, right? All of this has come together to make us, everything is so transactional. We're always seeking these outcomes or products, or, you know, it's a blue or red issue. It's, you know, there's no purple in the middle, it seems, right? So like, how can, in that pool of shared meaning, how can we prioritize having discussions, making the effort, and understanding that there will be more gray area, more unanswered. We're going to cultivate even more questions by asking the questions, and we're going to leave those questions there rather than walking away with answers. I think that everything that you said, Kami, just was like, I felt like I was in a spiritual retreat, kind of coming to understand this world that we're in. And that's just it, right? We didn't create all of those things. So it's not on us. The burden is not on us to correct them all in that moment. And we also have to allow the space for there to be this nebulous kind of world where, or interaction where there can be opposing viewpoints, and that cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable and okay, right? We have to get comfortable with the cognitive dissonance of it all. And in that space, we keep that pool of shared meaning, we can have those conversations continually. But if we're shying away from it because we're seeking outcomes all the time, or we're seeking to persuade or move to the right or wrong, the moral discussion and dilemma, then that's what's causing us to further retreat into our corners, I think.
When I think of anger as an emotion, a very strong emotion, and I'm in that setting with somebody, I hope, and I've done it, but I continue to hope that I will always view it with empathy, to find out what is there that obviously brings such emotion forward, and begin to listen and sit with the person to get to a point where we can have empathy for them, because I don't believe that everybody wants to be in that state, because it's very disruptive to your well-being. And I think, but trying to understand where that comes from, and then how to then break through that, particularly if you're in a leadership role and you have employees that come in and things, because you don't know what they may have faced before, or when they walked into the office. We don't know that. We may don't spend enough time to know that in a relationship with our employees. But to understand that that's coming from a deep place, and that we want to have empathy to move us forward, to then have conversations, because it may not be the right time. We have to really, for me, have empathy for those that are in that emotional state. And it may be difficult for us because we may be just as angry and upset, but as leaders, I think we have to model that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one thing to have very strong feelings, and you know, that they rise to the level of being angry, but it's another thing to be disrespectful or hateful. Now that what you're not going to do is do that, at least with me. And so I think it is incumbent, especially working in diversity, equity, and inclusion, to hold that space for people to have opposing views and to feel whatever emotions they're feeling, but to not allow them to cross a line and be disrespectful. We have to hold a space, you know, that is respectful, that all ideas are, you know, welcome, and that if anyone is violating that, it goes back to the boundaries conversation earlier, then, you know, we need to reset the ground rules for the discussion or the dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, all great points, especially Darlene, what you were getting at with the piece around empathy and understanding and perspective taking as a way to sort of work through that anger that people might feel, or just the disagreement that they have. And I'm reminded, I was doing some work with a DEI leader on campus, and they were telling me, you know what, a lot of people are surprised when they hear this coming from me as a DEI leader, but white supremacists aren't inherently evil, right? They've just been indoctrinated into a belief system that is about oppression and lifting up one particular group at the expense of others. And so I just think it's so powerful that when, here's someone who's a respected DEI leader on campus presents that frame, it really does emphasize then sort of kind of what you were bringing up in all of us, sort of the power of context, the power of polarization. And I also would say, from my lens as a psychologist, the more uncertainty people are experiencing in the world around them, the further they're going to hang on to those things that they feel they can be in control of. And if that's their beliefs, then I think that that really does contribute to people retreating to these sides. But you're right, if we can sort of be those models and address our own anger, our internal cognitive distance, as you say, Kevin Ibrahim, around connecting or distancing, I think that can be really powerful. So again, I would encourage people to use the chat or Q&A if they have questions that they'd like to have answered. I mean, I'm thinking also, as we're all part of the USC community, in the coming months even, how would you recommend then to people, whether they're, let's say, sitting in a staff meeting or a faculty meeting, and you can feel that energy of a conversation sort of just coming in like a wave that, oh, we're heading into territory now around politics or beliefs or these hot topics that we're talking about. What would you recommend someone do in sort of a very concrete way, perhaps if they are running the meeting or even if they're just a participant?
I'll start. I've been wanting to share this particular acronym that I think has been helpful. Last year, the leadership team within the Business Office of Dornsife went through a training with an outside firm, and they taught us something called COIN, which stands for context, observation, impact, and then next steps. And I use that framework quite a lot in communicating with others, because sometimes as the leader, we have to set the context for maybe why the temperature is rising in the room based on the observations that we're making. And I know that Darlene, in the EDD program, students are taught how to do observation and use that as part of their methodology for the research in their dissertations. And so this idea of really reading the room and understanding what's being communicated non-verbally, I think, again, the onus is on the leader. So here I would say the responsibility is an individual responsibility. And then once you do the observation, so you've got the context in the observation, then you need to express what the impact, I've heard people say things like, that's not my experience, but here's how that sounded to me, or that here's how that might land on someone in a similar situation. I mean, by using I statements or contextualizing how the harm can be felt, then I think that helps bring us to a place where we can talk about next steps. And the next steps would be like, so how do we work together, knowing that we have this animus in the room, or this, potential polarity that is starting to surface? How can we move past this so that we can be successful as a team? And I don't think this is going to get any easier, because what the pandemic has taught us is that we're in a hyper team environment, working from home. We may not be physically together in a conference room, but every time we get on a Zoom, we're in a conference room, we're in a virtual conference room, having to listen and share and wait our turn and then lean in and lean back. And all those are new skills for people. Mm-hmm. We haven't had to do that. It's very different when you are in a actual room communicating with people versus when you're doing it virtually. But if there's one thing that we've been taught, is we are not alone. We have to do this together, and we have to be more effective working together. So I think the leader has to use something like COIN to help rebalance what's going on in the room.
Mm-hmm. And to feel that responsibility as leader to even make that first overture. I think that's great. How about others?
Well, when I think about about a leadership role, and I'm conducting the meeting, right, even on Zoom, And I hope that we provide the space where people are in a position where they feel comfortable, that they're willing to share. And you can have all the norms, you can set everything, but something can trigger. But I would hope that a norm would be, particularly like in my class, you can remove yourself and there's no penalty for that. That happened recently in a class with mine, where the situation and the readings really triggered this young man to feel very emotional, and he left the room. He actually left the classroom. Now, he said to me afterwards, thank you, because I didn't go look for him. I didn't go, he obviously felt that need, and that was okay. So somehow in our interactions with each other, that has to be explicitly said, not just implicit, with the leader to say, I need a safe space. And right now I don't feel safe. And we need to provide those opportunities. I look back now that we need to be more explicit about it, not just assume. I think that we had created those norms with the intergroup dialogue in the class, and we set up our norms. So I think it was okay. I think he just was worried, just like the students are with their professors. But I think it's incumbent on the leader to create that space where people can feel acknowledged, that they're going to take care of themselves, and it's okay.
I love that piece around leadership. One thing that I work with, so I work with faculty and staff, around the campus. And I always tell people that there's a big difference between saying my door is always open and then actually going out and connecting with your staff or students and inquiring about how they're doing. And for me, what you were getting at, Darlene, that really speaks to power and responsibility, right? Being able to recognize that it takes a lot of courage for a staff person or a student in that case, or a junior faculty person to raise their hand and to be the one to say that they have concerns about what's being said. So I do agree there's responsibility in that way. And so we have a question that came in the chat or in the Q&A that's related. How can we respond with empathy and in a way that creates an opening to conversation when politically polarized? And how often, when politically polarized and often angry comments come our way, not through conversation, but by other means, emails. Okay, so how do you create space to have conversations with empathy when it might not be live, right? When it might be in email or if live in chat boxes? What does a person do who's running that space?
Quay, this is Kami here. So it's a great question, because increasingly our lives are lived in these digital ways, and it is asynchronous. And so it's difficult. It's difficult when you can't have a conversation and then you have to resort to texting or typing. And it's much, much harder to do that because there's so much more room for misinterpretation. But I'll put it this way. Darlene used the word feeling. And for me, that's what this comes down to. It doesn't matter what the specific argument a person is making on a candidate or an issue. It's not about the issue or the arguments. It's really about how that person feels when they make those arguments or when they hear those arguments. And so the first thing to do in these conversations, whether it's asynchronous digitally or whether you're sitting across from the person or whether you feel like, oh no, this conversation is about to go off the rails. When you get to that point, the first thing to do is deal with the emotion. Number one, there's a great quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He says, don't raise your voice, improve your argument. And I love that. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's a similar quote from someone named Arthur Brooks, who works at the American Enterprise Institute, very conservative. He says, we don't need to disagree less. We need to disagree better. And for me, how do you disagree better? Because we're always going to disagree, is you take that emotional element out of the equation as much as you can. And the one way you can do that is just acknowledge the emotion. Say, like, it sounds like this had a real impact on you. It sounds like immigration is a really big priority for you. And that is a neutral statement, but it acknowledges where they're coming from. Blood pressure goes down, cortisol goes down, guard comes down, right? Now they're not the enemy anymore. Now you acknowledge how they feel. Then two is, Darlene made this point as well, respond with curiosity. Now you're saying, now I want to learn. Now the point of the conversation is to understand. You brought this point up about immigration. How did you get to that viewpoint in your life? It's an open-ended question. It's not loaded. It's not, why are you so crazy to think this, right? It's not a yes, no question, and it's not loaded. It's a neutral question that's geared to be curious. And then the third element is you've taken the emotion out by acknowledging it. You've been curious, you want to learn more, and then you've become a partner in thinking about it. You fix this thing together. It's joint brainstorming. What do you think we can do to make sure that this issue is not a problem anymore? And then they present, and now they're using this front part of their brain instead of that reptile emotional part of the brain. It's not fight or flight anymore. It's a completely different thing, but it has to start with diffusing emotion.
I love that focus on emotion. So there's another question in the chat. And so this is just an interesting, just another angle to what we were talking about to continue this, but how do we open the conversation when we are worried about retaliation if our opinions are different than, and the person says those above us? So I interpret that as in the hierarchy. So if it's a supervisor or someone you report to, what do you do then if they're the ones who hold a belief that's different than yours and you're in that position? And does anything change, right? Does your strategy or approach differ in any way?
I think one of the things that I was thinking about is I definitely agree with what Kimberly and Darlene were talking about as far as leadership taking an active role in creating that space for this. And so whether it's asynchronous via email, text, or whatever, what I really love about what we're getting to here is that willingness to be a learner, be new to this experience together. So just like Kame was mentioning, like, wow, this sounds like it's very important to you. How can we together continue this dialogue? How can we come together to continue this discussion? What is the framework that we're going to move through this with? Easier said than done sometimes when things are fast and furious. But if we just take that mindset of all being new to this together, we're all in the virtual space together, we're all new. So leaders can ask their teams, hey, I need your help. We're going to create a safe space. What does that look like? So in facilitation for training, we often ask the attendees to define the ground rules for our classroom, our virtual classroom. So in a meeting, take 5 minutes at the beginning. If there's a lot happening in the world around all of us, what are we agreeing to do for this meeting today? Let's take 5 minutes to reflect. And to that COIN acronym that Kimberly was talking about, that really helps people focus in on the observation and impact before moving on. But I think as an individual contributor, I think you should feel empowered to also advocate for that and ask for it. And I think requests of leaders, hey, can we create this space where we can safely share opposing viewpoints? And you'll know pretty quickly whether or not that's going to be possible. And I think that would be to kind of test the waters and see, can we all together collectively determine how we're going to share opposing viewpoints in this virtual realm, in our meetings, in our classrooms. I'd like to see more individual contributors having the confidence to speak up and model that, and it's referred to as managing up sometimes, but I think inviting us all in as though we're all new, we're all learners, with humility into that space would be a way to do that. And the more people do it, the more I think it'll get easier to live in that area.
And I would just add, because when I initially heard you read the question, Quaid, and then I read it for myself, I do understand this power differential, but I think the skills are the same, whether you're the subordinate or the person in the leadership role. Start in a stance of curiosity and, suspending your judgment or your assumptions about your leader. Sometimes people want to, I've heard this in my career, like, I want to hear your views. I want to know what you're thinking about this. I want you to push back. Now, that hasn't been about the election. I'll be truthful that it isn't necessarily someone saying they want me to push back politically, but just fundamentally in terms of the work that I'm doing. There's been that invitation to take an opposing stance on something. And I think if you're not doing that, you are demonstrating to the person who's basically navigating or, kind of controlling your career at that point, your boss, that you're not willing to take a risk. And there's risk taking gets rewarded. like when they say no risk, no reward, we know in so many different aspects of our workplace that risk taking gets rewarded. So it may feel like you can't say something, or you feel worried that you're going to get misunderstood by your boss. But sometimes I think you're putting too much on the power differential, and the boss actually is welcoming that courage to say something that may be opposing.
Yeah, I love that. I think it is really important to check, in with our presumptions of the other person. And if anything stands out in this entire panel, thank you so much for everything you've shared. Curiosity is really important. I'm really glad, though, Kimberly, that you mentioned and sort of validated the fear that a lot of people feel in managing up or in speaking up. And perhaps they will have had past experiences that didn't go so well, or that they've seen someone else be crushed or retaliated against for saying something that's different or contrary. And I think you're getting at something that I think is really important here. We've been talking a lot about vulnerability. We've been talking a lot about fear and risk. And there are differing levels of putting yourself out there. There are different levels of risk taking. And I think that that's a really important piece too. So maybe your first step or your first foray into, suggesting that your department have conversations about this isn't sort of rolling in hard and deep, sort of demanding that a lot of things change right away, but testing the waters, as Kevin Brahim said, sort of suggesting, hey, what about this? Oh, being curious and saying, oh, I heard another department was doing this, and really sort of gauging that space so that you can then make informed judgments about what your next steps might be. But we have a couple minutes left. I'd like to just open it up to the panelists. If there's sort of any sort of one-liners or last remarks that you'd like to share with the group, with our audience, please go ahead.
I do, Quaid, and thank you for that opportunity. A word that we heard earlier was the word humility. And for me, it's so important in having these conversations. And I just give my quick example of the lesson in humility. I got a personal tour. A friend of mine worked at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, right, here in the Pasadena area. And when I was there, I saw it looked like a painting, but it was a photograph. And on the photograph, it looked like little specks, little tiny planet type images. And I asked, what is that? He says, that is, he said, do this with your hand, make a triangle. He said, point it up at the sky. He goes, we did that in the night sky to a part of the sky that was completely black. We thought there was nothing there. They pointed the Hubble telescope at that patch where they thought there was nothing, and they saw billions of galaxies. We are one planet of 8 in one galaxy. They found billions of galaxies in a place where they thought there was nothing. When I heard that, I felt cosmically insignificant. The fact that my neighbor voted for Trump and that the person down the street had a yard sign for a school board candidate that I thought was awful, it made zero difference in the world, right? Feeling that cosmic insignificance is an ultimate act of humility. And that feeling of humility is one that I carry into conversations with me every day. That, you know what? It really doesn't matter if you think this or that. I'm going to learn something from this conversation. And I give myself permission to say, this conversation, I cannot build a bridge here. I will always try, but sometimes give myself permission that it's just not going to work out. Move on. Life is too short.
Pick your battles, right? And humility. Love it. How about others?
For me, I think it's always, what are we willing to invest in a relationship to move forward in our work together, or even in our families? If you really don't want to invest, as Kami said, that because it's just not, then that's okay. Don't feel guilty about it. But if you really do see that there is some hope and work, then figure out a way to do that by being curious, by listening, by having humility, by working on it. Because what we, as Kami so brilliantly said, we're social beings and we want to be in relationship. So whenever we can maintain those and expand them, I think that would be, for me, my expectation. And when you rupture them, it's very painful. It's still emotional. Even if you have good reason, it's still emotional. It does take something from you. And so rather than reduce, I would want to expand the relationship.
Great.
And I would build upon the bridging comment that Kami made. So Again, I'm going to reference the Othering and Belonging Institute and the work that John Powell does, but he talks a lot about bridging, and he said that bridging is talking to someone you disagree with, and the purpose is to see and recognize people. And so I think that if that is your goal, then you should go for it. But I also know that it is not the magic cure for what is ailing us as a society. We still have systemic inequalities and structural racism that needs to be dealt with. So this is not an either or, it's more of a both and. And the last thing I would say, and this goes to the point of, establishing boundaries and understanding when it's not the time to lean in. I remember Reverend Michael from Agape said that life is a series of gains and losses. And so you just have to decide, am I in a period now where this is like something that I'm going to gain from doing this bridging exercise, or you go cut your losses. And I think that it takes some emotional, intelligence and some maturity on the part of the person engaging in a dialogue with a difficult or engaging in a difficult dialogue with a person to understand, is this worth it? Is this the, moment that I'm going to spend? Is this the thing that I'm going to spend my time on in this moment? Or is this something that I can just walk away from?
I love that. And in that also, what gains can I make from the losses as well? And Kevin, you want to bring us home?
Yeah, Kimberly, I love that, the synchronicity of all of this, because you mentioned both and for me, like two things I'll offer from the world of improvisation is that yes and, right? So once you start that work, continue it, right? So I made a stride, I made a small part of the bridge right now. The other aspect is, they say in improv, bring a brick, not a cathedral. This is a slow process, right? So you're going to build that bridge little by little, and it doesn't have to be the full conversation out of the gate. It can be one small part of that bridge. And if it's that commonality, that one thing you can focus on, that's where you start, and then you keep going, and then you keep going. It's an ongoing process. Forgive yourself for not being able to do it all at once, and understand that it's going to take a lot more than just one conversation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to all the panelists, and thank you all to the participants for joining us for this. Thank you to Dornsife and Rossier, as well as Campus Wellbeing Education. And I would just like to remind everyone that we're continuing in the fourth part of this series next week on the 19th, where we will have Dean Pedro Noguera and Bob Shrum from the New Political Future, I believe, join us in conversation. So thank you all very much for your time.